The Brass Washer That Changed History. The Untold Story of Beatrice Schilling. Part 1. The Sky That Betrayed Them. September 15th, 1940, 11:47 in the morning, 22,000 feet above the Kent countryside, a young man named Colin Gray was about to learn the cruelest lesson war could teach. Not about courage, not about sacrifice, about betrayal by the very machine that was supposed to keep him alive. His Spitfire hummed beneath him, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine singing its familiar song of controlled fury. Below, the English Channel glittered like hammered silver. Above, clouds stretched toward infinity. And directly ahead, filling his gun sight with the cold geometry of death, was a German Messerschmitt, BF 109, 400 yards, closing fast. The German pilot had not seen him. Colin could tell by the lazy way the enemy aircraft held its course, the slight wobble in its wings that betrayed a man scanning the horizon, looking everywhere except behind him. In aerial combat, the pilot who sees first almost always wins. Colin had the advantage. He had the angle. He had the kill, 300 yards. His thumb hovered over the firing button, that small red circle that separated life from death, victory from defeat. His breathing slowed, his vision narrowed, everything in the universe compressed into this single moment, this singular purpose. 200 yards. The Messerschmitt's nose dropped suddenly, plunging into a steep dive. The German had seen something, sensed something, felt that invisible presence that combat pilots develop after enough near misses. He was running. Colin followed. What else could he do? You do not let a German escape when you have him dead to rights. You push the stick forward, feel the negative G-forces lift you against your harness straps, and you follow him down into the screaming dive that will end with your gun speaking and his aircraft falling. Colin pushed the stick forward. The negative G lifted him against his straps, and his engine died. 1,030 horsepower, gone in a single heartbeat. The propeller that had been clawing at the air with furious purpose now windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. The Merlin's roar became silence. The gun sight drifted off target as the Spitfire began to lose speed, lose purpose, lose everything. Colin cursed. The word burned in his throat, bitter with frustration and the copper taste of fear. He knew exactly what had happened. Every RAF pilot knew. They had been warned, briefed, shown diagrams and given explanations. They understood the physics perfectly. Understanding did not help. The carburetor had flooded. During the negative G maneuver, fuel had surged upward instead of flowing down into the engine. The float chamber, that elegant piece of peacetime engineering, had done exactly what physics demanded. It had drowned the supercharger. The engine had starved. 2 seconds, maybe 3. In aerial combat, 2 seconds is a lifetime. 2 seconds is the difference between a kill and a miss. 2 seconds is enough time for a German pilot to pull out of his dive, check his mirrors, realize his pursuer is helpless, and either escape into the clouds or circle back to deliver the killing blow. The Messerschmitt pulled out of its dive at 8,000 feet. Colin watched it go, watched his 5th kill vanish into the gray clouds over France. The German pilot did not even look back. He did not need to. He knew the British could not follow. Here's the first truth this story will teach you. The greatest dangers in life are rarely the ones you can see coming. They are not the enemy in your gun sights or the obstacle in your path. They are the hidden flaws, the silent failures, the small betrayals that strike at the moment you can least afford them. Colin Gray was a skilled pilot. He had done everything right. He had found his target, positioned himself perfectly, executed textbook tactics, and he had lost because of a float chamber designed by engineers who had never imagined their engine being turned upside down in a screaming dive at 20,000 feet. The flaw was not in Colin, the flaw was in the system he depended on. And here is what matters: Colin could not fix that flaw himself. He could not reach into his engine while flying and redesign the carburetor. He could not will his Merlin to work differently. He was trapped by the limitations of a machine someone else had built. This is the position most of us find ourselves in, most of the time. We operate within systems we did not create, using tools we did not design, following rules we did not write. When those systems fail us, we feel the same helpless fury Colin felt watching his target escape. But here is also the hope somewhere. There is always someone who can see the flaw clearly, someone who has the knowledge, the skill, and the courage to fix what others accept as unfixable. The question is whether that person will be allowed to act, or whether bureaucracy, prejudice, and procedure will stop them before they can save lives. This story is about such a person. Her name was Beatrice Schilling. And by the time you finish reading this, you will understand why her name should be as famous as any generals, any ace pilots, any wartime leaders. She saved thousands of lives with a brass washer the size of a coin. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. Part 2. The English Disease. The Germans had a name for it. They called it Die Englische Krankheit, the English disease. By the autumn of 1940, Luftwaffe pilots had figured out exactly how to exploit the Spitfire's weakness. Their tactical manuals spelled it out in cold, precise language that any flight instructor could teach. When a British fighter achieves a position on your tail, execute an immediate steep dive. The Spitfire's engine will cut out during the -G maneuver. You will escape, or you will have the opportunity to turn and engage the British aircraft while it is helpless. Simple, elegant, deadly. The Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine that powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109 used direct fuel injection. There was no float chamber to flood, no carburetor to drown. A German pilot could roll inverted, dive vertical, pull -G for 10 seconds straight, and his engine would never miss a heartbeat. The fuel went where it was supposed to go, regardless of which direction down happened to be at any given moment. British pilots had no such advantage. Fighter Command documented everything. They were methodical about it, almost obsessively so. Every combat report, every maintenance log, every debriefing session generated paperwork that flowed upward through the chain of command. By October 1940, the statistics told a damning story. Engine cutouts had occurred in 43% of diving attacks, nearly half, every time a British pilot committed to an aggressive dive. He was essentially flipping a coin. Heads. His engine kept running. Tails. He became a glider. Squadron commanders estimated that 80 to 100 pilot deaths could be directly attributed to carburetor flooding, not to German skill, not to British mistakes. To a flaw in the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that everyone knew about and nobody had fixed, the reports piled up in filing cabinets at the Air Ministry. Pilot Officer Thompson, engine failure during pursuit, enemy aircraft escaped, Flight Lieutenant Davies, engine cut out at 15,000 feet, aircraft entered spin, pilot killed, Sergeant Williams, carburetor flood during engagement, aircraft shot down by pursuing enemy, pilot missing, names, numbers, dates, deaths, and still nothing changed. Here is the second truth. Bureaucracies are designed to prevent mistakes. They create procedures, require approvals, demand documentation. In peacetime, this caution is often sensible. It prevents hasty decisions, catches errors, ensures that changes are properly tested before implementation. But in crisis, bureaucracy becomes a tomb. The same systems that prevent mistakes also prevent solutions. The same caution that protects against error also protects against progress. Rolls-Royce knew about the carburetor problem. They had known since 1937. Their engineers had designed a solution, a pressure carburetor that would work regardless of aircraft attitude. Estimated completion date, late 1943. 3 years. In 3 years. How many more young men would die because their engines betrayed them at the worst possible moment? The Air Ministry knew the problem was urgent. But urgent problems still required committees, reviews, budget allocations, testing protocols. The machinery of bureaucracy ground forward at its own pace, indifferent to the fact that every day of delay meant more names added to the casualty lists. This is the trap that kills more dreams, more innovations, and more lives than any enemy. The trap of "we're working on it." The trap of "the solution is coming." The trap of tomorrow. While people die today, someone needed to break that trap. Someone needed to ignore the committees and bypass the approvals and fix the problem now, today, with whatever tools were available. That someone was working alone in a laboratory at Farnborough, reading combat reports with growing fury, calculating solutions in her head, and preparing to risk everything she had worked for. Part 3. The woman who understood engines, Beatrice Schilling, was not supposed to be an engineer. She was born in 1909 in Waterlooville, a small town in Hampshire where expectations for young women were clearly defined. Her father was a butcher. Girls from families like hers became secretaries, nurses, shopkeepers. They learned to type, to tend the sick, to balance accounts. They did not strip motorcycle engines down to their smallest components and rebuild them on their bedroom floors. Beatrice had other plans. At 14, she used money saved from odd jobs to buy a broken motorcycle. Her parents assumed she wanted to ride it. Perhaps they imagined her puttering around town on a small machine, enjoying the modest freedom that 2 wheels could provide. Beatrice did not want to ride it. She wanted to understand it. She spread newspapers across her bedroom floor and began the patient work of disassembly. Every bolt, every spring, every gasket received her complete attention. She learned what each part did, how it connected to the others, why it was shaped the way it was. She sketched diagrams and took notes. She read repair manuals borrowed from the local library. She asked questions of the mechanics at the garage down the street, and when they tried to dismiss her as a curious child, she asked more questions until they realized she actually wanted the answers. She rebuilt that motorcycle better than it had been before, not just functional, but improved. She found inefficiencies the original manufacturer had missed. She understood, at 14, what many professional engineers never grasp: that every machine is a compromise between competing demands. And a clever person can often find better compromises than the ones built into production models. By 25, Beatrice was racing that motorcycle at Brooklands, the famous banked circuit where men tested the limits of speed and machines tested the limits of physics. She averaged 106 miles per hour around the concrete banking, her body pressed flat against the tank, the engine screaming beneath her. She earned the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had received it. The award recognized sustained speeds over 100 miles per hour on the Brooklands outer circuit. a feat that required not just courage, but mechanical excellence. Your machine had to perform perfectly. One missed beat from the engine, one moment of hesitation, and you would lose the speed you needed. Racing taught Beatrice what textbooks could not. She learned how engines behaved under stress. She learned to feel when something was wrong before the gauges showed it. She learned that the difference between winning and losing, between life and death, often came down to small details that seemed insignificant until the moment they became everything. She also learned about resistance, about what it meant to be a woman in a world that did not expect women to understand machines, much less master them. The racing circuit was not welcoming. Male competitors questioned her presence. Officials doubted her qualifications. Every achievement had to be proven twice, first against the machine and then against the assumptions of everyone watching. Beatrice responded to doubt the same way she responded to a challenging corner on the track. She leaned in harder. She proved them wrong with results, not arguments. She understood that some battles cannot be won with words. She earned her engineering degree from the University of Manchester in 1932, one of the very few women to do so. The program was rigorous, designed to weed out students who lacked the mathematical ability or the physical stamina for the profession. Her male classmates worked in study groups, supported each other, shared notes and encouragement. Beatrice worked alone, not by choice, but by necessity. She was not invited into the study groups. She was not offered the notes. The support systems that helped other students navigate difficult courses did not extend to her. She graduated anyway. She graduated with honors. Here's the third truth. Talent is never enough. The world is full of talented people who never achieve what they are capable of, because talent without persistence is just unrealized potential. Beatrice Schilling had talent, certainly. She had a natural ability to understand machines, to see how components fit together, to imagine improvements that others missed. But talent did not get her through engineering school. Persistence did. The refusal to let doubt and exclusion stop her. The willingness to work twice as hard as her peers because she had to work alone. Every obstacle she faced taught her something valuable. Exclusion taught her self-reliance. Doubt taught her to trust her own judgment. Resistance taught her that results matter more than approval. By the time she arrived at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, she had been forged by a lifetime of proving herself. She was 31 years old. She was the only female engineer at the RAE. She was the principal technical officer for carburetor, research, and development. And in November 1940, a file landed on her desk that would change the course of her life and save thousands of others. Part 4. The Solution. The file was thick with combat reports, maintenance logs, and engineering analyses. Beatrice read it over 3 days, making notes, sketching diagrams, running calculations in the margins. She interviewed pilots who had survived engine failures. She studied the physics of fuel flow under varying G-forces. She examined sample carburetors that had been pulled from damaged aircraft. By the end of the first week, she understood the problem completely. The SU carburetor used in the Merlin engine was beautifully designed for its original purpose. In normal flight, gravity pulled fuel down through the system into the engine. The float chamber regulated the flow, ensuring the right mixture of fuel and air for efficient combustion. It worked perfectly when the aircraft was flying straight and level, or climbing or in a normal dive. But combat was not normal flight. When a pilot pushed into a steep dive, negative G-forces threw everything upward. Fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The float dropped to the bottom. The valve opened wide, flooding the system with far more fuel than the engine could use. The supercharger drowned. The engine died. The solution, Beatrice realized, was obvious once you saw it clearly. If the problem was too much fuel during negative G, restrict the fuel flow. Not completely, or the engine would starve, just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get what it needed for maximum power, but not enough to drown. A brass disc with a hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Size the hole to allow exactly enough fuel for maximum power and nothing more. Simple, elegant, cheap. She machined the first prototype herself, cutting and grinding the brass until the disc was precisely the right thickness. The hole exactly the right diameter. She tested different hole sizes, running the modified fuel system on bench engines while measuring fuel flow, engine output, and response to simulated negative G conditions. 17 different hole sizes. 6 weeks of testing, endless calculations and measurements and refinements. The optimal diameter was 0.04 inches, a hole smaller than the tip of a pencil. Through that tiny opening, exactly enough fuel could flow to sustain maximum engine power. No more, no flood, no cutout. Bench tests were perfect. Engine failures during simulated negative G maneuvers dropped from 2 seconds to a fraction of a heartbeat. So brief, it would not matter in combat. Beatrice looked at her bench test results and felt the weight of what came next. Bench tests were not combat. She needed to test the restrictor in an actual aircraft, under actual combat conditions, with an actual pilot whose life would depend on whether she was right. Here's the fourth truth. Knowledge without action is just information. Beatrice now knew how to save pilots' lives. She had the solution in her hand, a small brass disc that cost less than £1 to manufacture. But knowledge does not save anyone. Only action does. The problem was authorization. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF aircraft was a court-martial offense. The regulations were clear and the penalties were severe. Even a modification that seemed obviously beneficial had to go through proper channels, testing protocols, review committees, safety certifications, paperwork. Beatrice estimated the authorization process would take 6 months, maybe longer, given wartime delays and the competing demands on Air Ministry attention. 6 months. How many pilots would die in 6 months while her solution sat on a shelf waiting for approval? She had 6 brass restrictors in her workshop. She had a decision to make. She could wait. She could follow procedure. Submit her findings through proper channels. Let the bureaucracy do its work. If the modification eventually failed and killed someone, she would be blameless. She had done her job. She had reported her findings. She had followed the rules, or she could act. She could install her modification without authorization, test it in combat without approval, and face the consequences if something went wrong. If she was right, pilots would live who would otherwise have died. If she was wrong, she would be responsible for a man's death. She would face court-martial. Her career would be destroyed. Her reputation would be ruined. Everything she had worked for, every obstacle she had overcome, would mean nothing. Beatrice thought about the pilots she had interviewed. Young men, most of them. Some younger than her own students had been. They trusted their engines to keep them alive. They did everything right, fought bravely, executed perfect tactics, and died because of a float chamber designed for peacetime flying. She thought about the squadron commanders she had spoken with, exhausted men who sent their pilots into the sky each morning and counted how many came back each evening. Men who had to write letters to families explaining that their sons, their husbands, their fathers had been lost over the Channel or over France or over the green fields of England itself. She thought about the combat reports, page after page of documented failures. Engine cutout during negative G maneuver. Enemy aircraft escaped. Engine cutout during pursuit. Aircraft shot down. Engine cutout at altitude. Pilot killed. Names, numbers, dates, deaths. And she thought about what her life had taught her, that obstacles exist to be overcome, that doubt is best answered with results, that some battles cannot be won by following the rules. On March 17th, 1941, Beatrice loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and brass restrictors. She rode 40 miles through the English countryside to RAF Biggin Hill. Part 5. The risk the morning was cold, gray, typical for English March. Mist hung low over the airfield as Beatrice guided her motorcycle past the guard station, her RAE credentials, earning her a cursory nod and a wave through. Around her, the organized chaos of a fighter station preparing for morning patrol. Ground crews swarmed over Spitfires and Hurricanes. Pilots gathered for briefings. The smell of aviation fuel and cigarette smoke mixed with the damp morning air. She found the chief mechanic in a maintenance hangar, a sergeant named Harris, with oil-stained hands and 16 years of experience with Merlin engines. He was the kind of man who knew every bolt and wire by touch, who could diagnose a problem by the sound an engine made. Beatrice showed him the brass disc. She explained the physics, the testing, the results. She told him she needed to install it in an aircraft without authorization, without paperwork, without anyone in command knowing. Harris turned the restrictor over in his fingers. His face showed nothing. "Such a small thing," he said quietly. "How do you know it works? Bench tests, 6 weeks of them, perfect results every time." "Bench tests aren't combat." "I know. That's why I'm here." Harris looked at the Spitfires on the flight line, young men climbing into cockpits, adjusting harnesses, checking instruments, young men who trusted their engines to keep them alive. "I've lost 11 pilots to engine cutouts," he said. "Peterson, Williams, that Scottish lad, McLeod. Couldn't have been more than 20 years old." He paused. "Good men, all of them." He looked at Beatrice, looked at the restrictor in his hand. "If this thing works," he said, "I don't care if the king himself hasn't authorized it." He picked up his welding kit and walked toward the nearest Spitfire. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere was one of the most experienced pilots in fighter command. New Zealander by birth, RAF by choice, warrior by nature. 54 combat missions, 7 confirmed kills, shot down twice, survived a mid-air collision, walked away from a crash landing that should have killed him. He had also reported engine failure 4 times, all during diving attacks, all in the last 3 months. On March 17th, his Spitfire was the first aircraft fitted with Beatrice Schilling's restrictor. He did not know it. Nobody told him. This was Beatrice's choice. If the modification failed, she wanted the blame to fall on her, not on a pilot who had been given no choice in the matter. She would carry the weight of failure alone. Harris welded the restrictor into the fuel line in less than 2 minutes. The modification was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Deere climbed into the cockpit at 07:15 hours, standard morning patrol. 2 hours over the channel, watching for German formations. Beatrice stood at the edge of the airfield and watched him go. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were still. She had trained herself, long ago, to separate emotion from action. Fear could exist in her chest without reaching her fingers. Doubt could whisper in her mind without changing her decisions. but standing at the edge of Biggin Hill, watching Alan Deer's Spitfire climb into the gray English sky, she felt the full weight of what she had done. If the restrictor worked, Deer would never notice anything different. His engine would perform perfectly. He would complete his patrol and return, and she would have proven that her solution worked in combat. If the restrictor failed, if it starved the engine of fuel, if the weld cracked, if the hole was the wrong size, Alan Deer would fall out of the sky. Somewhere over the channel, his engine would die and not restart, and he would spiral down into the cold gray water, and Beatrice would spend the rest of her life knowing she had killed him. The Spitfire became a speck against the clouds, then nothing, just empty sky. Beatrice waited. Here's the fifth truth. Every meaningful action carries risk. The greater the potential reward, the greater the potential cost. Beatrice could not save pilots' lives without risking one first. She could not prove her solution worked without betting everything on being right. This is the burden of those who choose to act. The safe path is always to do nothing, to wait for approval, to let others take the risks. The safe path never changes anything. The safe path lets the filing cabinets fill with reports of engine cutouts and pilot deaths, while committees debate and procedures are followed. Beatrice had chosen the dangerous path, not because she was reckless, but because she understood that some things are worth the risk. Some problems cannot wait for permission to be solved. Now she waited, and every minute felt like an hour. The ground crews moved around her, maintaining aircraft, checking systems, performing the thousand small tasks that kept a fighter station operational. For them, this was a normal morning, another patrol, another round of maintenance, the war grinding on as it always did. For Beatrice, nothing was normal. Everything hung in the balance. Her career, her reputation, her conscience, and somewhere, out over the channel, a pilot's life. Harris found her at the 1-hour mark. He brought her a cup of tea. She took it, but did not drink. Her stomach was too knotted for tea. "He's a good pilot," Harris said. "Best in the squadron. If anyone can test your gadget properly, it's him." Beatrice nodded. She had chosen Deer for exactly that reason. Experienced, aggressive. The kind of pilot who would push into a dive without hesitation. The kind of pilot who would find out fast whether the restrictor worked. 90 minutes. The patrol should be ending soon. Deer would be turning back toward Biggin Hill. If everything had gone normally, if his engine had not failed over the channel, if he was not floating in a life jacket right now, watching his Spitfire sink into the cold gray water, if he was not already dead, 2 hours and 17 minutes after takeoff. A Spitfire appeared over the airfield. Beatrice saw it first. She had been watching the sky so long her eyes ached. One aircraft. No smoke. No damage. Flying steady. Deer landed smoothly. Taxied to dispersal. Cut his engine. Climbed out of the cockpit. He was grinning. Pilots did not grin after routine patrols. They looked tired, tense, relieved to be alive. Deer looked like a man who had just discovered a secret the world had been keeping from him. Harris reached him first. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Deer pulled off his helmet. His grin widened. Problems? That was the best this Merlin has ever run. He had encountered 2 BF-109s over the channel. They had spotted him, turned to engage, then dove when he maneuvered behind them. The standard German escape tactic. The tactic that had worked against British pilots for nearly a year. Deer had followed. Full negative G, stick pushed forward. The dive that should have killed his engine. The Merlin never stuttered. Full power through the entire maneuver. Deer had closed to 150 yards before the German pilots realized something was wrong. He hit one of them, watched pieces fly off the Messerschmitt's tail. The German had limped toward France, trailing smoke. First confirmed damage Deer had scored in a diving attack since August. "I don't know what maintenance did to this aircraft," Deer said, "but I want it done to every Spitfire in the squadron." Harris looked at Beatrice. Beatrice looked at the ground. "I think that can be arranged." "Sir," Harris said. Part 6. The wildfire word spread through fighter command like flames through dry grass. Biggin Hill installed restrictors in every aircraft within 48 hours. Pilots reported flawless engine performance. Diving attacks that would have ended in failure now ended in kills. Squadron commanders called from Hornchurch, from Kenley, from Tangmere, and Northolt, and Manston. What had Biggin Hill done to their engines? How could they get it? The Air Ministry found out within a week. Beatrice expected fury. She expected court-martial threats. She expected to be called before some panel of stern officers who would explain, in cold and precise language, how her unauthorized modification had violated regulations, endangered aircraft, potentially killed pilots. Instead, she got a phone call. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, the man responsible for every fighter squadron defending London and southeast England. "Miss Schilling," he said, "I've just read the combat reports from Biggin Hill. I'm told you're responsible." Beatrice braced herself. "Yes, sir." "How fast can you install this device in every aircraft in fighter command?" Beatrice blinked. Whatever she had expected, it was not this. "Sir, you heard me. How fast?" She did the math in her head. 43 stations, 3,000 engines. If she trained installation teams at each base, worked around the clock, prioritized frontline squadrons. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 5 if Rolls-Royce can manufacture the restrictors fast enough. "You have 4, Park said. "I'll handle the authorization. You handle the installation. Don't let me down." Here is the 6th truth. Sometimes the systems that seem immovable will suddenly give way. The bureaucracy that has blocked every attempt at progress will suddenly step aside. The approval that seemed impossible will suddenly be granted. This happens when results become undeniable, when the evidence is so clear, so overwhelming, that even the most cautious administrator cannot argue against it. Beatrice's unauthorized test at Biggin Hill had produced exactly this kind of evidence. Combat reports with data, pilot testimonials, documented kills that would have been missed opportunities without the restrictor. Air Vice Marshal Park was a practical man. He did not care about procedure when lives were at stake. He cared about winning the war and bringing his pilots home. The restrictor worked. The evidence proved it. Park gave Beatrice what the normal process would have denied her for months. But the authorization was only the beginning. Now she had to actually install 3,000 restrictors in 4 weeks. Beatrice assembled a team of 3 engineers. She plotted her route like a military campaign, identifying which stations needed the modification most urgently, which could wait, how to maximize the number of aircraft protected in the shortest time. Biggin Hill was just the beginning. Then Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, Northolt, Manston, Hawkin, Gravesend, Croydon, 43 stations in 4 weeks. She trained ground crews personally at each station, demonstrated the installation procedure, supervised the first fittings, checked every weld, measured every hole diameter, rejected any restrictor that did not meet her specifications. She slept in hangars when there was time to sleep, ate sandwiches on her motorcycle when there was not, rode through spring rain and occasional German bombs. Some stations welcomed her. The pilots at Hornchurch lined up to shake her hand after their first successful diving attacks with the restrictor installed. They had heard the stories from Biggin Hill. They wanted to meet the woman who had given them back their confidence. Other stations did not know what to make of her. A woman giving orders to their mechanics, a civilian telling RAF personnel how to modify their aircraft. At one station, a wing commander refused to authorize the installation. He told her to come back when she had proper paperwork from the Air Ministry. Beatrice pulled out Air Vice Marshal Park's direct authorization. The wing commander went pale. The installation proceeded without further objection. At another station, a young pilot approached her while she was inspecting a completed installation. "Miss Schilling," she looked up from the fuel line she was examining. "Yes." "I wanted to ask you something." He hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. "What did you do to deserve such an important job?" Beatrice considered the question. She could have talked about her degree, her racing career, her years of research. She could have listed her qualifications, explained her technical expertise, justified her position. Instead, she said simply, "I'm good at it." The pilot thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. "Fair enough. Here is the seventh truth. Competence is its own credential." The best way to silence doubt is not with arguments, but with results. Beatrice did not waste energy defending her right to be there. She demonstrated it through her work. Every station she visited, every installation she completed, every pilot who came back from a successful diving attack, proved her value more eloquently than any words could have. By April 20th, every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had a restrictor fitted, 2,847 Merlin engines. 4 weeks of non-stop work. The device needed an official name. The Royal Aircraft Establishment called it the RAE restrictor. The pilots called it something else. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, gave it the nickname that stuck, Miss Schilling's Orifice. Crude RAF humor. Beatrice did not mind. If a dirty joke helped pilots remember who had saved them, she would take it. Part 7. The Transformation. The results were immediate, measurable, and undeniable. Fighter Command tracked every statistic, every engagement, every kill, every loss. They had been tracking these numbers since the beginning of the war, building a detailed picture of how the air campaign was progressing. March 1941 before the restrictor. Engine cutouts in 41% of diving attacks. Kill-to-loss ratio 1.4 to 1. 51. British fighters lost 73. German aircraft destroyed. April 1941 after the restrictor. Engine cutouts in 0.3% of diving attacks. Kill-to-loss ratio 3.1 to 127 British fighters lost. 84 German aircraft destroyed. The transformation was immediate, measurable, undeniable. A small brass washer with a hole in the center had changed the mathematics of aerial combat. But statistics tell only part of the story. The real transformation was psychological. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's top aces, described the change in a letter to his family. "It's like flying a different aircraft. Before, every dive was a gamble. Would the engine keep running or wouldn't it? You'd hesitate for just a moment, and that moment could kill you. Now, there's no hesitation. The Merlin runs perfectly, no matter what I do. I can fight the way I've always wanted to fight." Flying Officer Johnny Johnson. who would become the RAF's top-scoring ace, flew his first combat missions in April 1941. Years later, he reflected on what Beatrice's invention had meant. The older pilots told me about the engine failures. They said you had to be careful in a dive. Your Merlin might quit on you. By the time I started flying combat, that problem was gone. Miss Schilling had fixed it. I never thought twice about diving on a German. That probably saved my life a dozen times. Squadron leader Douglas Bader. The legendary pilot who flew with 2 artificial legs, credited the restrictor with transforming his tactics. Before Schilling, we fought defensively. We were afraid of our own engines. After Schilling, we fought the way fighter pilots are supposed to fight. Aggressive, committed, no hesitation. She gave us our confidence back. Pilot officer Alan Deere, the man who had unknowingly tested the first restrictor, wrote about his experience years later. I didn't know I was the guinea pig until weeks afterward. When Miss Schilling told me what she'd done, I wasn't angry, I was grateful. She took a risk on me so that thousands of other pilots wouldn't have to take the same risk. That takes a different kind of courage than what we needed in the cockpit. Here is the 8th truth. Confidence is as valuable as capability. The RAF pilots were skilled before the restrictor. They were flying the same aircraft, using the same tactics, facing the same enemies. What changed was their belief in their machines. When you trust your tools, you can commit fully to your actions. When you doubt them, you hesitate. And in combat, hesitation kills. Beatrice gave the pilots more than a brass washer. She gave them permission to fight without holding back. She removed the doubt that had been undermining their effectiveness. This is true in every arena of life. The person who trusts their preparation can perform at their best. The person who doubts themselves holds back, hedges, never fully commits. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is not to make them more capable, but to remove the obstacles that prevent them from using the capability they already have. Luftwaffe intelligence noticed the change within weeks. German after-action reports from April mentioned that British fighters were no longer breaking off diving attacks. The tactical advantage that had served them so well was evaporating. By May 1941, German tactical manuals had quietly removed the section about exploiting British engine failures. The English disease had been cured. Part 8. The legacy that continued. The restrictor remained in service until 1943. Rolls-Royce finally delivered the pressure carburetor that year. The proper engineering solution that used fuel injection principles similar to German engines, but converting existing aircraft took 8 hours per engine. Fighter Command could not ground its squadrons that long. So the restrictors stayed. Many aircraft flew with Miss Schilling's orifice until 1944, some until the end of the war. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew how to install it. The device cost less than £1 to manufacture. A brass washer, keeping pilots alive for 4 years. Beatrice did not stop working after the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had endless problems, and each one could kill pilots. She developed cold start modifications for Spitfires deployed to Russia. Arctic temperatures around Murmansk dropped to -40 degrees. Fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died within hours. Engine oil turned to thick sludge. British pilots could not start their aircraft in those conditions, and Soviet ground crews had never seen a Merlin engine before. Beatrice designed a cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. She wrote a manual simple enough for Russian mechanics to follow, with diagrams that did not require knowledge of English. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk through the brutal winter of 1942. She researched high-altitude performance. Late-war Spitfires flew at 35,000 feet, chasing German reconnaissance aircraft and high-altitude bombers. At that altitude, the air was thin, oxygen was scarce, and fuel mixture had to be precisely calibrated. Too rich, and the engine flooded. Too lean, and it overheated. Beatrice developed altitude-compensating modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Test pilots reported better climb rates, better maneuverability, better chances of catching Germans who thought they were safe at high altitude. By 1945, she had completed 17 major projects at Farnborough: cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, supercharger efficiency. Each project saved lives. None achieved the fame of the restrictor. She married George Naylor in 1938, a mathematician at the RAE, who later flew bombers with 625 Squadron, 31 missions over Germany, Distinguished Flying Cross. Bomber Command had the highest casualty rate of any RAF branch. 1 in 2 crew members did not survive the war. Every time Naylor took off, the odds said he might not come back. Beatrice understood those odds better than most. She had calculated probability for a living. She knew exactly how thin the margin was between life and death at 20,000 feet over Germany. Naylor beat the odds. He came home in 1944. They never talked about what he had seen. He never asked about her work in detail. Some things live better in silence, understood but unspoken. Some burdens are carried together without being discussed. Here is the 9th truth. Expertise often comes with burdens that others cannot share. Beatrice understood probability. She understood exactly what the numbers meant when her husband climbed into a bomber. She could not unsee that knowledge, could not pretend the danger was less than it was. But she also understood that some things must be done regardless of the odds. Some causes are worth the risk. Some people must fly into danger, and some people must wait for them, and both require a different kind of courage. In 1948, King George VI appointed Beatrice an officer of the Order of the British Empire. She went to Buckingham Palace, received the medal, posed for photographs with the king. A reporter asked her what the secret to her success was. "Solving problems," she said. "That's all engineering is. Someone has a problem. You find a solution. You make it work." The reporter asked if being a woman had made her career more difficult. Beatrice shrugged. "I didn't have time to think about being a woman. I was too busy being an engineer." The next morning, she was back at Farnborough, working on jet engine problems. The world was moving on. Propeller aircraft were giving way to jets. New challenges needed new solutions. She never reached director-level positions. Those were reserved for men. Unwritten rules that no one acknowledged, but everyone followed. She never complained publicly. She preferred real engineering to paperwork anyway. After the war, she worked on the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile. She researched wet runway braking. Landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. She published 3 technical papers on how water on runways affected tire friction, dry physics that saved wet landings. She helped design a bobsled for the RAF Olympic team. Strange project for an aeronautical engineer, but bobsled design involved the same principles she had mastered: aerodynamics, weight distribution, friction management. The team used her design in competition. They did not win medals, but they did not crash either in bobsledding. That counts as success. In 1967, Dan Gurney's Eagle Mk-1 Formula One car developed an overheating problem that his team of engineers could not solve. Someone suggested calling the old lady who had fixed the Spitfires during the war. Beatrice was 58 years old. She looked at the cooling system for 2 hours, asked questions, took measurements, made calculations. Then she found the solution. Engineers half her age, with degrees from the best universities in the world, could not fix what she solved in an afternoon. It's the same as any other engine problem, she told the team. You understand the physics. You find the simplest solution. You make it work. Here's the 10th truth. Real expertise does not expire. The principles Beatrice had mastered at 14, rebuilding a motorcycle on her bedroom floor, served her at 58, diagnosing a Formula One racing car. The fundamentals of how engines work, how heat moves, how systems fail, do not change with fashion or technology. What changes is complexity. What remains constant is physics. Those who master fundamentals can adapt to any new challenge. Those who only learn surface techniques are helpless when the surface changes. She retired in 1969, spent her final years the way she had spent her first years working on motorcycles, restoring vintage machines, racing at classic events, maintaining the Norton she had owned since she was 14, the motorcycle that had taught her how engines behaved under stress. She died on November 18th, 1990, age 81. The obituaries focused on one thing, the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice. Everything else was footnotes. Part 9. What we learned today. A pub in Farnborough is named the Tilly Schilling. The Brooklands Museum displays her racing trophies. Universities have buildings bearing her name. Engineering schools teach the restrictor as a case study. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results. But the real lesson is not about engineering. It is about something more fundamental. Here are the lessons this story teaches. First, the greatest dangers are often invisible. The RAF's problem was not German skill or British cowardice. It was a float chamber that worked perfectly until it did not. The pilots were dying because of a design decision made years before the war, by engineers who never imagined combat conditions. Look for the hidden flaws in the systems you depend on. They will reveal themselves at the worst possible moment. Second, bureaucracy protects against change, both good and bad. The Air Ministry knew about the carburetor problem for years. They had procedures for addressing it. Those procedures were designed to prevent hasty mistakes, but they also prevented rapid solutions. When crisis demands action, procedure can become a barrier. Know when to follow the rules and when the rules must be broken. Third, talent without persistence is potential without achievement. Beatrice faced obstacles at every stage of her career. Exclusion from study groups, doubt from colleagues, resistance from men who believed women did not belong in engineering. She overcame these obstacles not by arguing, but by producing results that could not be denied. Fourth, knowledge without action is just information. Beatrice knew how to solve the problem, but knowing was not enough. She had to act, to risk her career and her conscience by installing unauthorized modifications in combat aircraft. Knowing what to do is the beginning. Doing it is everything. Fifth, sometimes you must risk everything to save anything. Beatrice could not prove her solution worked without testing it in combat. She could not test it in combat without risking a pilot's life. She made the decision to risk one life to save thousands. That decision took courage that most people never have to summon. Sixth, results silence doubt more effectively than arguments. When Beatrice's restrictor worked at Biggin Hill, the Air Ministry's resistance collapsed overnight. The evidence was undeniable. Do not waste energy defending your right to act. Demonstrate your competence through results. Seventh, confidence is as valuable as capability. The pilots were skilled before the restrictor. What changed was their belief in their machines. When you trust your tools, you can commit fully, remove doubt, and capability can finally express itself. Eighth, expertise in fundamentals never expires. The physics of engines do not change. Those who master fundamentals can adapt to any new challenge. Those who only learn techniques are helpless when conditions change. Ninth, sometimes the systems that seem immovable will suddenly give way. Air Vice Marshal Park could have rejected Beatrice's unauthorized modification. Instead, he embraced it when results become undeniable. Even bureaucracies can change direction. 10th legacy is measured by lives affected, not titles held. Beatrice never reached director-level positions. She never received the recognition that male engineers with lesser accomplishments enjoyed, but thousands of families remained whole because of what she did. Thousands of futures were lived instead of buried. That is a legacy beyond any title. Part 10. The Call. This story happened more than 80 years ago. The Spitfires are museum pieces now. The pilots who flew them are mostly gone. The war they fought has passed into history. But the lessons remain. Right now, somewhere in your life, there is a problem that everyone knows about, but no one is fixing. A flaw in a system that works perfectly until it fails catastrophically. A procedure that prevents hasty mistakes, but also prevents urgent solutions. Right now, somewhere, there is someone who could fix that problem. Someone who has the knowledge, the skill, the solution ready to implement. Someone who is waiting for permission that may never come. Right now, you might be that person. Beatrice Schilling was not supposed to be an engineer. She was a butcher's daughter from a small town in Hampshire, and the world had clear expectations for what someone like her could achieve. She exceeded every expectation. She saved thousands of lives. She changed the mathematics of aerial combat with a brass washer the size of a coin. She did it by refusing to accept that problems could not be solved. By trusting her own expertise when others doubted her. By acting when everyone else was waiting for permission. What problem are you waiting to solve? What permission are you waiting to receive? What risk are you afraid to take? The filing cabinets of the world are full of reports, documenting problems that everyone knows about, but no one fixes. Proposals that would save lives, improve systems, correct injustices, all waiting for approval that never comes. Meanwhile, somewhere, people are suffering. Opportunities are being missed. Lives are being lost. The safe path is always to wait, to follow procedure, to let someone else take the risk. The safe path never changes anything. Beatrice Schilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with brass washers and rode 40 miles to Biggin Hill. She risked her career, her reputation, her conscience. She bet everything on being right. She was right. Thousands of pilots came home because of what she did. Thousands of families stayed whole. Thousands of futures were lived instead of buried in military cemeteries. One woman, one motorcycle, one brass washer with a hole in it, and the courage to act when everyone else was waiting for permission. That is how you change history. Not by following procedure, not by waiting for approval, by seeing a problem clearly, finding the simplest solution, and making it work, By taking the risk when the risk is necessary. By trusting your expertise when others doubt you. By acting when action is needed. Somewhere, right now, there is a problem only you can solve. What are you waiting for? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The world needs more people who are willing to act when action matters. Beatrice Schilling saved thousands of lives, and almost nobody knows her name. Let's change that. Like, subscribe, share, and remember the courage to act changes everything. Disclaimer. This story is created solely for educational and informational purposes. It aims to provide relationship guidance and awareness, not to target or identify any individual. The events and characters depicted are entirely fictional, intended for entertainment and learning. Our content is advertiser-friendly and does not promote hate, offense, or harm in any form. The goal is to help viewers gain insights and make informed decisions based on life experiences.